Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Forum Tent at Splendour in the Grass 2018. My name is Leanne de Souza, and I'll be with you for the next 90 minutes with this incredible panel and conversation. I'd firstly like to start by acknowledging the Bundjalung people and their elders past and present, and acknowledge that we're on Bundjalung country here, very special country, and also to the song men and women from this place. This is a music festival, and I'd just like to pay our respects. I'd also like to firstly acknowledge beautiful Helen Marcou on the end standing, or who you'll hear from shortly. Helen and I were invited by Faye. I'd like to acknowledge Faye from the Splendour in the Grass Forum to co-curate and work on this conversation and bring this incredible panel together for you today. So thank you both, Helen and Faye. I got the gig to facilitate it. Like I said, so my name is Leanne de Souza. I've spent a 25-year career in the music industry as an artist manager and passionate about a lot of the topics and stuff we'll talk about today. So it's sort of a happy accident that we've ended up here, but it's a great gift. I also acknowledge my position of privilege and as a white woman working in the music industry, and to be able to have these conversations and take this space. And it's not always like that for everyone, as we know. I'm going to quickly, before I do the panel, I just want to thank you also for coming. You're all here at 12:30. Excellent. On the first day, Splendour, not still setting up your tents. So well done. I'm just going to quickly give a who's who of the panel, and then I'm going to give you a bit of sense of where we're going to go for the next 90 minutes. And everyone is going to have an opportunity to have the floor, and really some amazing wisdom is going to be shared. So I'll start from my close here, who is Henry Rollins. Welcome, Henry. Musician, spoken word artist, commentator and activist. Thank you for being with us. Next along, we've got Nkechi, singer, songwriter from Saskwatch and Double J presenter. Thank you, welcome. We welcome Stella Donnelly, musician and songwriter, and a very busy lady at the moment, touring around the world. Thank you for being with us. We have Tracey Spicer, journalist, writer and campaigner, and authored a fantastic book called The Good Girl Stripped Bare. Great to have you, Tracey. Then we have Bri Lee, the fabulous Bri Lee, another writer and also lawyer. Fantastic book called Eggshell Skull, a memoir, which we will be discussing later. Thank you. Welcome, Bri. And down the end, we have the amazing Stacey Piggott, who's a music industry publicist and stalwart and campaigner, and works very, very hard in campaigning around the Your Choice movement, which we'll be discussing towards the end of the session. So welcome all of you. Thank you. I want to, for those of you welcome to have come in, this session you will have read, it is about consent in the post-MeToo world, and sort of a bit of a trigger warning. There will be some conversations through it that are regarding sexual assault and harassment, so just be aware of that, and I'll mention that again a few times as we work through the conversation. We really also wanted this session, we all agreed, to be about the future and change and what we can all individually do in our lives, in our workplaces, in our families, etc., to make change and positive change. But to talk about the future, I just really wanted to acknowledge the past and some of the great things that have happened in Australia. And so, Helen, while I've got you here before you dash off, you've been an incredible leader in Victoria around the, I'll let you talk more about it, but the Sexual Assault Taskforce. And I just thought you might want to bring the audience and the panellists up to speed with some of that work that's helped us end up where we are today.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Thanks. Hi.
Standing mic up, please.
Hello? Hi. Can everyone hear me? I'm not going to yell. No? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Leanne. And before I begin as well, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands on which we meet and pay my deepest respects to any elders past, present and emerging in future that are here. To begin, I am from the music industry. So my partner and I have run Bakehouse Studios in Melbourne for around 28 years now. And we were catapulted into the sort of activist world when there were some liquor licensing reforms and policies that were closing down venues in Victoria. And we were at the helm of an organisation called SLAM, which came together and to change this policy and prove that live music didn't equal violence. So 20,000 people marched out on the street to Parliament. And the next day, our lives really began as activists. We were very naive. We thought we'd have this great rally and go back to our usual lives. But that's when the negotiation with government began. So many of you might be aware of how Melbourne is such a vibrant, incredible, rich and deep music city. It didn't happen by accident. There are a lot of very passionate community and industry fans that made that happen. So fast forward to 2015. So I sit on a lot of government regulation roundtables, committees, panels, and advisory groups. And I was about to retire from Slam. I had activist fatigue. It's not a really well-paying job being at the front line of activism. And I was acutely aware, there was a group called Listen that were posting stories, and these were our musicians and our artists, posting stories around sexual assault and sexual harassment that was happening within their community. So I felt a deep moral obligation to do something and use my privilege on this government roundtable. So I'd quickly gone from becoming an yapping at the heels of government and biting their ankles to actually having a seat at the table. So I wrote to the then Minister of Justice in Victoria, Jane Garrett, and she unwaveringly gave us a task force to tackle policy around sexual assault and harassment in licensed venues. Now, this isn't only a problem that happens within licensed venues, but you can imagine after nearly 6 years of championing our music community and these spaces as being safe spaces that mitigate violence, to know that there was this intrinsic and underlying problem of sexual assault and harassment was something that we had to act on, and particularly for our artists. Artists are often micro businesses. We had a duty of care to look after them. They're not afforded the same workplace protections as other workers are. So this policy evolved, and here we are in 2018. There's a task force that's come together. We've written a training module around education of hospitality workers, staff in live music venues, security staff. There's a suite of marketing reforms and tools and collateral that's there for the general public, and it will be a fully evaluated program. This was done with the help of the Victorian State Government, and they invested $200K into this. It took a long time because the mechanisms of government work really slowly because it's taxpayers' money. So it has to be carefully and robustly scrutinised and presented. Now, the findings will come out soon, and there is an appetite for the state Labor government down there to take it further and share this policy with other states, other venues, and it can be translated. So some of the work that's come out of that is Dr. Bianca Philibert that Stacey might talk about later, is a criminologist from New South Wales that helped write this policy, and we worked her really robust and rigorous research where she had 400 case studies of assaults that had happened in Melbourne licensed venues. Her team recently went out to Falls Festival, and they're doing a first sort of evaluation and looking at recommendations for festivals and creating safer spaces. So we're really looking forward to that. But I'm not going to spend time here. You're here to listen to these brilliant panellists, and thanks to Leanne and Faye for being on the team to put this together, and I'm really looking forward to this brilliant and robust discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Helen Marcou, thank you. Speaking of the work, I love how you talk then about at work, and I think there's been a lot of work done, and everything sort of, as we know, hit a tipping point last year with hashtag MeToo, and in Australia, hashtag MeNoMore. It was so we're part of a broader timeline of social change, and a lot of that work's had been being done, and it kind of tipped over into the public awareness. And Tracey, you've been a real leader in the work that's been done. So before we sort of talk about what next and where we're going to go with consent, could you sort of talk about what triggered now and the work you're doing and what's next, and sort of share a bit of that with us, please?
Yeah, when I wrote my book last year, which was, oh gosh, it came out in April, I detailed a lot of instances of sexual harassment and indecent assault in the workplace. And so many women contacted me and said, gosh, the same thing happened to me. And then when the Harvey Weinstein story broke in the US, I felt incredibly guilty to have been a privileged white woman in the Australian media for 30 years and having not told these stories that had happened to the vast majority of my colleagues. So I got together an investigative team with the ABC in Fairfax. We did the story on Don Burke, we did the story on Craig McLaughlin. And I realised that with Australia's defamation laws, which are some of the toughest in the world, they protect the wealthy and the powerful, there's no doubt about that, that this was not going to be enough. The investigative journalism was important because storytelling is what changes hearts and minds. That's what the MeToo movement is all about. But it wasn't going to be enough. The other thing I started to get frustrated about was that it was concentrating on the privileged area of the media and entertainment sector. And it wasn't filtering down to marginalised communities, people on the factory floor, people in retail and hospitality. I don't know whether you saw the figures that came out a couple of months ago. 9 out of 10 hospitality workers have been sexually harassed or assaulted in the workplace, either by their manager or by clients and customers. So this is a huge problem right across the social spectrum. We all know that. Then when Time's Up launched in the States on the 1st of January this year, I thought that is a tremendous movement. But I also was very conscious of the fact that it was criticised for being a privileged women in Hollywood kind of movement. So I got together with a whole bunch of other people who'd contacted me on social media. There were about 40 or 50 of us actually that started now. And we wanted to make a not-for-profit organisation that didn't necessarily get involved with the journalism or the storytelling, but that acted as a triage service. So anyone could come to us with their story of sexual harassment or indecent assault in the workplace, and we could connect them with whatever they wanted. Because if you speak to anyone who works in the sexual assault sector, you've got to be led by the survivors. Everyone wants different things. Let me just give you a few examples of that. I went out to meet a woman in Western Sydney the other day. She's 70 years of age. She was a migrant to Australia when she was 16, working in a bakery where she was repeatedly raped. And the owner of the bakery did this to all the young women who worked there. Several became pregnant, had to leave the workforce. It ruined her life. She then became a survivor of domestic violence in her first marriage. Now at the age of 70, she finally felt that she could share her story. I was the first person that she shared her story with. So I said to her, look, what do you need? Can I get you legal help? Can I get you counselling support? And she said to me, no. She said, I want to sit down in a room with this man who did this to me, and I want to tell him how it made me feel for more than 60 years. So we are trying to track down this man now. He would be in his 90s if he's still alive. So people want different things. Some women want restorative justice. Some women want to take the offender to court. But the vast majority of the women who've come forward to me, and it is 95% women, there are about 5% men who've come forward to me, they just want to tell someone their story and be believed. And that's why this movement's so powerful. So where we're at with now is we're getting our charity status at the moment. The YWCA is auspicing us, which means we can start doing a bit of advocacy work as well as the triage service work, which we're building at the moment. We're negotiating with the sector to make sure we're not replicating any other services out there, because the last thing you want is other services losing money and government support. But we're also talking to government, we're talking to business, we're talking to the unions, we're talking to the community sector about what kind of legislation needs to be changed and policies and procedures, but also how we affect that important cultural change. Having said that, I think that cultural change is happening right now. I mean, in New South Wales, we have a Conservative state government that has just announced a review of consent laws and sexual assault laws and is putting consent conversations into preschools and primary schools. Now, I never thought I would live to see something like that by a Conservative government. I live in Tony Abbott's electorate, one of the most conservative electorates in the country. And instead of going to barbecues and having blokes say to me, oh, you're a bit of a bloody feminist troublemaker, aren't you? They're saying to me, thank you for what you women activists are doing for our daughters and our granddaughters. So I'm sure Bri will talk a lot more about the legislative change that is required, both in a civil and a criminal sense. But what I can see happening now is the ground shifting beneath us. This is one of the most exciting times of activism that I have seen, I think, since the second wave feminists of the 1960s. Things are moving incredibly quickly, and we need to, each and every one of us in the room today, keep up that momentum by telling our stories in a supported and safe way.
Thank you, Tracey. Towards the end, this whole notion of consent, which is where we're going to go. But before we sort of zero in specifically on sexual consent and the law and that conversation, it's worth just sort of zooming out for a minute about what this sort of concept of consent more broadly is. You know, and in my personal experience and observations, I've represented a number of artists over the years. We've got artists here on the panel. It's highly nuanced, this idea of consent. Yes, there's sexual consent, but there's also consent about what you will or won't do. Or I'm often fascinated too around, photography or taking photos of people without their consent, even your children. Anyone that's got kids now, I've got a 17 and 15-year-old, expect me to ask their consent to post their photos of them on my social media. So it's a really broad spectrum with lots of different nuances in it. And we want to sort of touch on quite a few of those as we go around, the intimate space, yes, but also social, professional and cultural spaces that we all have to negotiate. And not just the panellists. Every single one of you in the room has a responsibility in negotiating these spaces. So I'd like to hear broadly from all the panellists, and I think I'll start with you, Nkechi, because I want you all to position yourself and your perspectives here. Where are you sitting? Why are you sitting on this panel today that's around consent, and how does that intersect with your own lives?
I guess my experience around consent is around being an artist in Australia, being a female artist in a very male... I'm the only female in a band that used to be 9 people strong, so I was one out of 9 people that was female. And also being, I think it's pretty obvious, being a person of colour living in Australia, the issues around consent when it comes to things that might be seen as minor, i.e. having your hair touched, or people feeling that once they've seen you perform that they've paid for a ticket, so they've paid for a piece of you, so it's okay for them to come up to you and kiss you, come up to you and touch you, pick you up. I guess that's really where my experience comes from when it comes to sitting on this panel.
Thank you, and we'll talk more about how you navigate that and what expectations and boundaries we can have. Stella?
Well, I put out a song called Boys Will Be Boys last year, and a week later the MeToo movement, the Harvey Weinstein allegations came out and everything went nuts, and I wrote that song never expecting many people to hear it. I wrote it so that people... I'm from Perth, I'd play it at gigs, and if I got to those people in the crowd, I was happy with that. So I had never expected it to reach the ears that it did, and I humbly stepped into being someone who could be a spokesperson for these kind of issues, and I'm obviously very privileged as a white woman in the music industry. The things that Nkechi just spoke about, I haven't experienced that, and in terms of people touching my hair and those sorts of things, but we all have our stories, and I feel like if I can help kind of get those stories out, that's why I'm here, really. And I've had things happen, like at Port Fairy Folk Festival, I had a stage manager think it was okay to just kind of come up on stage and pick me up. I had a dress on, and he picked me up and put me over his shoulders, slid his hand up my thigh, and took me off the stage in front of one of the biggest crowds I've ever played in front of, and just those kinds of things, and not knowing at the time I couldn't get the words to tell him that was wrong, and luckily he came up at the end of the day to get something signed. So I fucking tore him a new one, but I'd worked out what I was going to say by then, but not at the time, bloody hell. So yeah, things like that. People think that with women you can you can do whatever you want. We're kind of public property sometimes as female artists. So yeah, that's I think how I stand on it, I stand.
Thank you. And for those of you that haven't seen Stella perform, you will be rushing from this tent to the GW McLennan tent for 3 p.m. this afternoon. So is Stella. But also to hear Boys Will Be Boys perform live, and the connection in the audience with that song is really remarkable. And, it can't be easy, and thank you for that. Every audience is amazing. Bri?
So in 2015, at the end of 2014, I graduated from law school, and in 2015, I started a job as a judge's associate in the Queensland District Court. And that's basically a fancy word for assistant. And the judge I worked for did almost exclusively criminal law. And in the district court, that means sex and child sex offences, because the system is clogged with those types of offences going to trial. In Australia, the rate of people pleading guilty when they're accused of any crime is about 70%. It drops to about 30% if someone's accused of a sex offence, which means it's just trial and trial and trial, because people think they can get away with it, because often they do. So I worked for this judge, and part of the work we did was that we went out on circuit, which is where a judge from a major city gets posted out to a regional or smaller town that doesn't have the population to support a judge sitting there full time, but the people in those areas deserve to have their matters heard where they live and to be judged by their peers. And so in that year, I went out to 7 regional towns in Queensland, and what I saw was that justice looked very different, both in between each of those towns, and justice looked different in a major city compared to a regional town. Every week, we would have a new trial and a handful of new sentences. And by the end of the year, I was so incredibly angry and overwhelmed by the mundanity and how insultingly unoriginal most of the defendants were, that I decided to go to the police and make a complaint against a man who offended against me when I was a child. And that was just... What happened to me then was... it was almost like a camera pulling focus, where I had thought in the whole year that the trial was the bad bit, like that was really awful, and that what I was seeing every day in court was like so much courage and so much strength from these complainants and all these bullshit defendants. And then I started the process of making a complaint, and realised that actually if you get to trial, that is like the final tip of the iceberg. So my investigation took 2 years, culminated in a 2-day trial, and then I wrote a book basically about the process of going from one side of the justice system to the other side, and the perspective that I've been able to gain, which is just statistically speaking quite unusual, of someone who's qualified to practice law, has experience in the criminal legal system, and also has been a complainant. And gone to trial and been cross-examined and called a liar in the witness box. And that book is called Eggshell Skull. It came out in June. And since then, I've also been doing... The response has been quite overwhelming. Again, like Stella was saying, I started writing this book before Weinstein, before MeToo, before any of that stuff. And then it was just incredible timing that the book came out this year, once people's sort of ears had opened to these conversations and to these stories. And so now I do advocacy work. I'm doing a bunch of legal research with one of my old law professors. We're looking at Queensland specifically, because in Australia, criminal law is legislated by state. So I'm from Queensland. I'm focusing on Queensland at the moment, trying to basically just get update happening. Yeah.
Thank you. Amazing work. Well, Stacey, do you want to put where you sit in this discussion?
I'm here because I started a career as a publicist 20 years ago because I love music and I wanted to talk about music, and in the past probably 5 or 6 years, all I do is talk about sexual assaults and write statements about sexual assaults at festivals that we work on, counsel young female artists through exactly the experiences that Stella has had, help them deal with constant flows of dick pics and inappropriate engagements from fans and other industry people. And we had in our experience within our company multiple sexual assaults at one of the festivals that we work on, and then a really bad crowd crush, and we all just had enough. So we got together and created Your Choice with the guys from Unified, and started a campaign to try and get people to be aware of their behaviour and how their behaviour affects other people, and the fact that in our space, the behaviours that are accepted and tolerated within the music space and the festival space and the music venue space behaviours that would never be tolerated in a normal working environment. You know, one of the examples we use is when artists are sitting on stage and they're doing their job, stage managers, roadies, someone in the crowd throws a full can of beer at their head, and if you were in a boardroom giving a presentation and someone threw a full can of beer at you, it would be outrageous, but in our space it's something that's accepted. And I think we're just at the point now where we, you know, work really hard in this space to, you know, the artists are working really hard to deliver great experiences, industry is working really hard to deliver great experiences, and it takes one or two people to do something stupid that brings all of that work down. And within our industry, we have a huge sense of responsibility and accountability on us for putting people in these spaces, yet we're kind of limited with how much we can control it. And we just wanted to draw attention to that and get people talking about it, and, you know, encourage people to start critically thinking before they do stuff, rather than...
And we might talk more at the end with how you're doing that.
Yep.
Yeah, that'd be great. Which brings me to... Thank you, Tracey. Which brings me to our double outsider, the American and the man. How do you position yourself in this conversation today, Henry?
The main reason I said yes to being on this panel, so mainly I could listen, because all these brave people all over the world who have said that happened to me, and they have to stand up to their boss, their parents, their friends, their spouses, and admit this and be told, whoa, why weren't you talking about this 20 years ago, and it was your fault, and all of this bravery cannot be in vain. And so I want to get all these bad people nailed down, but as much or even more importantly, I want to figure out what we're going to do going ahead. Because this is, speaking very selfishly, this is the only century I've got. I'm not making it through this one. So it's got to get better before I'm dead, or somehow I will have failed. Because you can't come to a festival like this and be assaulted. That cannot be a possibility of anybody at a place like this. So what do we do going forward? Because if all we're going to do is nail bad people, good. But if that's all we're going to do, we're going through the yard and clipping the heads off the dandelions, but we're not getting the root of the problem. And so you're always going to be maintenance, maintenance, maintenance. I want a weed-free, I want a more evolved mindset on how men and women or humans in societies voulez-vous with each other. And so I'm interested in hearing any idea from the activists, the legal, the journalists, the artistic, the activist, artistic journalist types, all of us from different facets of this whole thing, hearing how everyone weighs in. So mainly, and I have quite a few stories and opinions on all this. I'm a male who came from the music industry. I live in Los Angeles, California, Hollywood. I have stories that will kill your lawn. I mean, there's just stuff that, common knowledge. Like a guy like Harvey Weinstein. People made jokes about him on comedy shows before anyone ever said, that bastard did something to me. Like, why are we making jokes about this? This isn't funny. Like, why is no one bringing down a hammer on this guy? It's not part of some 8 p.m. comedy patois. And here's just, I'm not trying to talk too long. Yesterday, a woman, we went out many years ago. I'm very old. We went out, I guess, during the Reagan administration, but we keep in touch. She wrote me, she said, "Dear Henry, you'll be very disappointed in me. I just got punched like 3 times in the ribs and twice in the face by some man she had been dating." And I wrote her back, I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Did you file a police report?" She said, "No." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because that's mean and vindictive." And I'm here in Australia. This is happening from thousands of miles away. So I said, "I can't get mad at you through the internet, but do you understand this is how people like him keep getting away with it? Because you didn't say something. Like, think about the next woman. Beyond yourself for just a minute. Think of the next, because this isn't the first time he did it. No way. He's too old for this to be the first time." And so how do we make someone not ever think of that as something to do? And so that's basically the long-winded version of why I'm here.
Thank you. Henry, we'll hear more shortly. And thank you all. Sharing that the personal intersection we all have with this is so broad and deep. And I think we'll move to the area of sexual consent first, and sort of talk about what that is, because that's so much at the core of this. I'd just like to repeat a bit of a trigger warning that we are going to talk about this area. It'll probably go for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll move into some of the other spaces that we have to navigate consent. So I think, Bri, I'm going to put you in the lawyer hat on first, and the context, and just sort of bring us this a very complex area. We're not going to be able to unpack it all in a short amount of time. But sort of that overview of sexual consent and the current context of that in the law, and what are some of the challenges around that, and that line between sexual assault, harassment, abuse. Could you talk to that, please?
Okay, so for the first chunk, it is tricky because one of the best and worst things about criminal law in Australia is that it's legislated by state. What that means is that the exact same actions between person A and person B can happen in Queensland compared to, where's a good place, Tasmania. And in one state, that defendant will be found guilty, and in another state, that defendant will be acquitted. So what I'll tell you is that across Australia, the sort of common understanding of consent is just about true for the legal definition, where it's sexual conduct or contact that one person basically didn't want to happen. The problem in Australia is not with the definition of consent, it's with a defence that is widely available, and it's called the mistake of fact defence. In Queensland, in the Criminal Code, it's Section 24. What it means is that if the defendant, in pretty much 95% of cases, the defendant is a man, if the man has an honest and reasonable belief that the complainant consented, he will be acquitted. If he voluntarily gets intoxicated, that helps him prove he had an honest belief that the complainant consented. And yet in those
I kind of want you to repeat that. Can you say that again?
Yeah, so yeah, it's outrageous. That's like the sort of, this is exactly where the advocacy and research I'm doing right now is happening, because like all of the states have Section 20, have mistake of fact. But for example, in Tasmania, they've made it so that if the defendant showed a reckless indifference, mistake of fact is not available to them. But we don't have that in Queensland. In Victoria, I think it is, they've said that voluntary intoxication will not help you prove that you had an honest belief that the complainant was consenting. So it's sort of, it is really important that the public are having discussions around consent. But the problem from a legislative perspective is not actually with the definition of consent, it's with these fucking bullshit other defences that are available to defendants. And so, yeah, in Queensland, the way I saw it played out most commonly in trials was that it just means that rape myths are like ripe for the picking by a defence barrister. So the most common response to unwanted and frightening sexual attention is the freeze response. Guaranteed. What it means is that if a woman has, if conduct starts escalating, or if it's from the beginning immediately unwanted and the complainant has that freeze response, which is the most common, if either of them have been drinking, even if they haven't, but they are known to each other, which is the most common situation where these offences occur, let alone if they're in a domestic setting, which again is where most of these offences occur, it is incredibly easy for a barrister to argue that his client had an honest and reasonable belief that she was consenting, because she cannot point to any conduct that she displayed that said that she was not.
Because she froze.
Because she froze. And so what I talk about, and what I try to talk about really publicly, is that all of the things that are most common to women who have been assaulted are exactly the factors that make it most difficult for her to prove that assault in a legal context. So almost always the defendant and complainant know each other, whereas like popular rape myths is that it's a stranger that jumps out of the bushes. It's way easier for a complainant to secure a guilty verdict if they have a physical injury or if there was a weapon used, because then a jury can sort of latch onto the idea that she felt threatened. Vast majority of sexual assaults occur without the use of a weapon. And people like to think that it happens, out in a park somewhere, out at night, dangerous, sort of foreign somehow situation, but mostly they happen in a domestic setting. So you don't have something like CCTV footage. And so, yeah, the mistake of fact defence undermines so much good work that otherwise could be done. And there's a really exciting movement happening now to basically have a positive definition of consent, where unless it's a clear yes, it's a no.
Now hold that there, we'll talk about that more in a minute. And sort of Tracey will buy in here as well, but I'm really interested as a layperson, not being a lawyer or anything. What is the difference legally between sexual harassment and sexual assault?
It's more a question of most of the time when people talk about it, the way they would understand it is that if someone sort of files a sexual harassment complaint, that will be often like with an HR department at work, or it will be a civil complaint, whereas a sexual assault is a criminal, like that's criminal conduct that can be prosecuted in criminal courts by the Department of Public Prosecutions. In terms of like physical actions, like what person A would do to person B, if the touching or interaction is in any way sexual, and it is not for any sort of medical purpose, it will constitute sexual assault. So there's not, I fight pretty hard against most uses of the word grey zone. And really with sexual assault, there's not much of a grey zone there.
Tracey?
That was a really excellent explanation, and too many of us don't understand the difference. It only occurred to me 2 years ago when an amazing woman by the name of Karen Willis from the New South Wales Rape and Domestic Violence Centre, who's been working in this sector since the 1960s, explained to me, I was telling her some of the things that happened to me in television years ago, calling them sexual harassment, and she stopped me and said, that's not sexual harassment, that is indecent assault. If that happened to you in the street, you would go up to the police and you would lay charges. I've had women come to me, I've had 2,000 disclosures now, and women have come to me, young actresses, and said, oh yeah, this happened at a party, but it was just this. They called it something very benign, and I had to turn around to them and say, that is digital penetration, that is digital rape, and you could go to the police and lay charges. That is not sexual harassment. So we really need to call things for what they are, and only then will we realise the seriousness of them and how commonly it happens in society. I just want to drill down a bit on what you said about the freeze response. There's some really interesting stuff happening internationally. I don't know if any of you have heard about the wolf pack gang rape case in Spain. The poor dear woman froze, as so many of us do. I've frozen in sexual assault instances. And because of that, the judge gave these men a very minor sentence. Caused outrage in Spain, and just 2 days ago, they've said they're changing their laws to yes means yes, not no means no. And that's replicating laws that have been brought in Germany and in Sweden. And there's even a discussion in the US about it at the moment, about enthusiastic consent, that we need to move on from the idea of certainly, yes, verbal consent, certainly non-verbal consent, but why not enthusiastic consent? Great sex can be great sex if the power balance is equal and both parties want it. So let's move the conversation on culturally to the fact that both parties are into this.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So anyone else want to talk about this concept of enthusiastic sexual consent? It was a big 7:30 story. Stella, did you want to?
I think, the common defence for that is like, where's the magic now? Where's the magic in sex if we're just having to, shake hands and, let's get on with it kind of thing. But I think we need to change our mindset, as you said, on what great sex can be, and be able to have, an equal, agreement into something. What's sexier than that? I just think that's pretty hot. Yeah.
Which makes you think, so there's this idea of enthusiastic sexual consent, this idea of giving sexual consent in practical terms, but what does giving consent sexually that's in public spaces? You know, and we're here at a festival, and if it's, you know, you're on a dance floor or you're in a lift, you know, that's what every woman's going to start nodding when, you know, when you're touched up, or all sorts of things happen. I'm sort of trying to ask, like, what does consent in those spaces look like? So if you were, you know, you're eyeing off someone on a dance floor and you know, there's some sort of attraction happening, how do you do that before you're all the way at the point you're actually going to bed together? Anyone got any comments or thoughts about what they do or don't do?
I get confused with this because I can't, like, in the festival sense, the issues that we come up with or come up against is people being groped, so unwanted touching. And to me, if you're dancing and you have your back to somebody and they come from behind and touch you, there's no consent going on there. There's no argument there. You haven't had any kind of interaction with this person. It usually happens because they're focused on watching an artist and they're not concentrating on what's going on around them. That's assault. That's not, you know, we're having a good time and going to rub up against you. And I mean, everyone in the room would have experienced that in a mosh pit where people get too close. But I think that there's, you know, if there's no questions asked, if there's no interaction with that person, then there's no consent there to start off with. And, you know, I don't understand how it's so hard. Like, I know I'm an old lady and I've been there, but you know, if someone's not saying anything, if someone's standing and frozen, they're not into it. If they're into it, you know, because they're all over it. If they're not all over it and they're not into it, then I just think that's a no. You're right. There is no grey area. Bri touched on, you know, rape myth. You make me think there's this sort of consent myth, and it comes to that great, you know, look what she's wearing, she's asking for it, myth. You know, and that sort of thing. So that makes complete sense as the woman, but there's this sort of, where's this social thing happen that because someone's wearing something sexy, the guys are allowed to touch her? Because that's the stuff that happens. The Saxon Mullen case, I don't know if anyone saw that in Four Corners, where the guy who raped her in an alleyway in King's Cross has
allegedly.
Allegedly, sorry, as I don't want to get sued.
Sitting next to the lawyer.
Just got a house in Pottsville, I don't want to get sued. Allegedly raped her in an alleyway in King's Cross, has gotten off now due to the fact that she didn't say no. And that's, you know...
He got off because of the mistake of fact defence.
She didn't say no. She didn't say yes, so he's not getting convicted because she didn't say yes, but he's getting off because she didn't say no. And I mean, that's got to change.
Yeah.
It's got to change.
Because his barrister was able to prove that he had an honest and reasonable belief that she was consenting. And so the jury can send a message simultaneously to the complainant that, like, we believe that you didn't want it, but we're also not willing to put him in jail for what he did. That's what mistake of fact achieves.
One of the things that kind of worries me is having these discussions with not only other women but with men as well, and trying to explain the level of fear that women have every day. And I think the only way I can really explain this, which is why I think we're talking about the freeze defence and also situations when women do say yes, but the actual answer is no, but they don't feel safe enough to have it, is the equivalent of if a guy walked out the door every day with the fear that at some point during the day, without his knowledge, someone much bigger than him is going to walk up to him and knock him the fuck out. That is the level of fear that women leave the house with. When we're checking ourselves in the mirror, we're looking at, are we asking for this? Are we asking for that? Is the way that I'm acting asking for this to happen to me? And it's the only way that I can really explain the level of fear that women have around this, because it would be easy to turn around to a guy and tell him to fuck off or just don't touch me or no, but there's also the realisation and the reality that on a physical level, there's that overbearing fear too, that we are going to get really hurt, and there's nothing that we can do, even if we don't want to be in that situation, to get out of it. Sorry, it's just something that I've just been thinking about. It's like, how do you explain this to... I mean, it's great that we're having this conversation in front of men and women and people who identify as something else, that there is also that level of fear that you have every day of, like, how am I not going to go through this? And which is why when you ask the question, what is an example of consent, it's so varied, and I think, for me personally, I think it's dangerous to say, well, this means that this is consensual and this doesn't, because it could in one instance and not in another. As much as saying yes can actually mean yes, and saying yes can also be no, but I'm in a social position where by saying no to you, I lose face, I lose friendships, I lose my ability to feel safe within my community because I've done a taboo. So as much as I believe that, yes, the conversation does have to move away from saying the word no means that, oh, now it is an assault or now it is rape. Saying yes, it's not as simple as yes or no, and it's not as simple as if you do this, this and this, then you are consenting or you're not consenting. I think it's a really dangerous thing to define them in to give them definite detail into what is consent and what isn't, because it's definitely not the case.
It's so nuanced.
Yeah.
One of the submissions that's been made to the New South Wales law reform sort of inquiry that's happening at the moment is to reassess the way we define or look at and understand sexual assault happening in relationships where there is domestic violence, because currently the courts don't have the sort of tools necessary to be able to acknowledge that where there has been previously physical violence, whilst on that Tuesday that the woman has made an allegation of rape, he might not have hit her for a week. In what situation is she then able to truly give consent when she knows that the advances that are being made towards her, sexual advances, if rebuffed, could easily lead to serious physical assault. And so I would agree, it's the conversation around what consent looks like and is lacking an understanding of the genuine fear that women have to say no at any point in time.
That's where it comes back to what you, on one of your interviews I researched, where you were talking about, swapping out jurors, and people are talking about swapping out jurors in these cases for sexual assault experts and sexual assault counsellors so that they can drill down into the victim's experience rather than having preconceived judgments on what sexual assault means, and if it is a husband who's doing this, whether it is actually rape or, part of being married. And I think that's a really important change that needs to happen as well in the legal system.
Thank you. I'd just like to shift perspective slightly before we shift perspective completely to the male here. But around the professional spaces, we haven't really talked about consent. That's get a bit like the line between harassment and assault, but also consent in the workplace. Because I know, Tracey, you do a lot of what NOW's doing is around that. Are there any conversations about what, consent? There are lots of relationships start in the workplace. It's the same. Everything's blurred. It's a spectrum. There's nuances. So what does consent look like in a professional place?
I do tend to agree that it is pretty black and white, a lot of this stuff in the workplace, and it has to be, right? It's a controlled space. There's best practice internationally, and we need to see that brought in Australia. Some of that kind of best practice is actually around seeing an increase in reported instances of sexual harassment and rewarding managers for that. Now, that sounds counterintuitive, right? But what's happening at the moment is people are being sexually harassed and indecently assaulted. They're frightened about telling their bosses, so they don't. They fear they're going to lose their jobs. And because of that, these perpetrators are like serial sex predators, like in the Catholic Church, and end up getting moved on to another work site rather than being punished. In fact, it's the survivors who are sidelined, silenced or sacked.
I think also sometimes there's the fear that if you do make the complaint, the worst thing that can happen is also that nothing happens, or that they've handled it so badly that the perpetrator is informed who you are and that you've made a complaint, and then proceeds to make your work environment extremely unsafe for you.
Definitely, and the research bears that out. In 1 in 2 cases, if you complain, there will be retribution against you, either by your colleagues or by your superiors. And that's why people don't speak out. It's terrifying. So if you can create a workplace culture where people feel safe to speak out, where cases are dealt with properly and in a public kind of way, and there's appropriate And this is where it gets tricky, because some people say, a lot of women say to me, I didn't want to speak out against the man because he's my colleague, I know he's got a family and I didn't want him to lose my job. So this is the other tricky thing in the workplace. A lot of women don't want to speak out about it because they don't want the perpetrator punished. They feel sorry for them. So we really need better workplace procedures where the perpetrators are punished appropriately for what they do and where the survivors are supported and not sidelined, silenced or sacked. But I do think it's quite a black and white thing. You know, speaking to what you said before, you know when it's a creepy touch, you know when it's a creepy arm on the shoulder or whatever. So there's a really clear line between appropriate workplace behaviour and not appropriate workplace behaviour. And I'll tell you where that lies. That lies in a power imbalance, because sexual harassment is not about sex all the time. It's generally about power.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to speak to the workplace stuff?
I've been in workplace environments, and this is not, it's entertainment based. Like a film, 6 weeks with these people. And they're all away from their spouses, if they have them, or whoever they live with. And this person from the art department is playing around with the person from the makeup department. And it just turns into this thing where someone kind of comes up, you want in on this? I'm like, actually, no. I'm here to work. And within these they become these toxic environments where it's always kind of spilling over. You're like, just not me, man. I really want to get some work done. And it becomes unnervingly uncomfortable. And to tie it in, as a male, I think one of the hardest conversations you'll ever have is speaking to you. Spoke so eloquently, how vulnerable and terrified you feel on any given day leaving. To get that through to a man, I understand you, I hear you, but rarely in my life have I ever felt like that. Some guy wants to knock me down, there's two men in the street. That's what it is. I do not fear getting catcalled, patted, leaned on. I'm a guy. It just doesn't happen to me. Thankfully, I'm empathetic and I listen. But to make men understand that vulnerability, I just hope going forward we can help young men get that, because it's so hard for a man to get, because it's just not in our world. The workplace environments, some of them I've been in, they're just so awful, because sometimes it's about like, hey, let's run around and that's sex, but then it comes from the top, producer, director, the main actor, that's about power. And it gets really gross. And Hollywood is full of the most awful stories. And these people aren't here to defend themselves, but I've been on set with it. I've heard a million tales, and it's not uncommon, and I've not heard it ever decreasing at all in my 30 plus years of being around it. And as a woman, I just don't know what I would do except kill the guy, which is not an option, because as a guy, no one's coming on to me with that kind of thing. If I was a woman, I don't know what I would do.
Which is where we wanted to go next, because I wanted to ask you, because men are crucial to, at a macro level, at this sort of institutional change and the power, and also at that micro level of individuals changing their own behaviours and actions. So a lot of what you talk about the workplace then, there's a lot of conversations in Australia. One of our great authors, Tim Winton, has spoken very eloquently about the concept of toxic masculinity and this sort of need for men sort of to justify who they are and what they do, and how actually it's not helping men at all. It's actually hindering the way that they can live their life in a positive way. So I just wanted, Henry, to share insights into, that was a great way to show the empathy of what it would be of a woman, but where are men in this conversation, and what do they need to do, and what are the benefits of men changing?
The men are the ones who need to do the changing. And so in a conversation like this, men should be doing a lot of shutting up, note-taking, and listening. And they should realize that we are coming from hundreds and hundreds of years of a male-dominated way. In any culture, any country, men have run the show since cave folks. Like a 99% men running the world, and you get what you get. Here's what we got, because this is what it looks like when men run the show. For better, for worse, for now. And so your idea of toxic masculinity, to me, comes from a gross sense of insecurity. Like the bully at school. If you drill down deep enough, he's got a rotten home life. Why is he beating up on other kids? Because someone's wailing on him. I'm not excusing bad behavior, but it's rarely coming from, I'm big and I like to hit people. It's like, I got an uncle, I got a dad, I got an older brother. Someone's knocking me around, and I push it, I send it going. And so that kind of masculinity, that kind of insecurity, it's hyper dangerous because it's someone seeking for validation through an abuse of power. And that's like, a sexual assault, dominating women, trying to dominate others in the workplace, in friendships, in marriages, because it comes from something that was done to them. And so basically, we all need a break. We need to be much better to each other. I've been fascinated by masculinity, not just because I'm a guy, because my father was coming from an insecure place, so his masculinity came from, watch me roll down the window and yell at the Chinese guy in traffic. Like, that was my dad's idea of, like, watch this. And I'm like, I'm 9, you're ruining my life, And so I was always fascinated by men I admired, like fighter pilots. They're upside down in a plane, they're like, well, we can do that. Or astronauts, these kind of cool under pressure types, like, shucks, is just my job. Well, that's how I want to be. Not hysterical, not abusive, and somehow secure in my masculinity. And I just think it's what's best about a man. They can be helpful, they can be empathetic, they can be kind. Some insecure men will say, well, you're being feminine. Like, you're acting like a bitch now. No, actually, real men are like me. We listen, we want to help. And when that is shown to young men as more of a strength, and maybe you can do that on the playing field, a lot of sports and men and hormones, that all goes together. Maybe you do that in school. Maybe fathers need to spend a different kind of time with their sons. As you can tell, I'm looking at going forward, making things better. And so toxic masculinity, I don't know how you untoxify it, except doing radical things like de-weaponizing the idea of being rich. Like, being rich should not be impressive. In my country, look who's rich. Some of the worst people in America. So let's de-weaponize money. Let's de-weaponize seniority, de-weaponize promotion, where I'm above you. I just got a corner office. I'm better than you now. We just need to make fun of it, poke holes in it, and get going. And so masculinity to me is a thing I laugh at more than embrace. I try and be not aware of it, because all I see is 99% downside and very little upside. True masculinity is not harmful. Otherwise, it's nothing but harmful. So.
Thank you. Listening to you then, I spent some time out in the Central Desert a few weeks ago, and there was an Aboriginal elder and used this thing. It just keeps sticking with me, and it's the conquer versus connection. And that, whether it's the ego, the dominant, when you say punching hot, this desperate need to conquer versus connecting. And if we can encourage our men and our boys and our friends to connect with each other, with the land, with their feelings, so much of that to help negate this, what we're calling toxic masculinity. So thank you. Did any of the panellists want to talk to or comment on any of that?
Yeah,
Stella?
Just in terms of, toxic masculinity, I always say, with the song Boys Will Be Boys and the whole, the generalised statement of boys will be boys, being used as a sort of excuse or a justification or, a gendered, admission, a gendered kind of like dismissal, I guess, of behaviour, whether that's just young kids being too rough in the playground, or a grown man, raping a woman, and I just think, I think it's just a really unfair generalisation to make for men. I've got a beautiful 16-year-old brother, and for the term boys will be boys to be used as something, from playground roughness to rape, and for all men to be bundled into that sort of category is pretty horrible, and it's pretty, in a way, it's a horrible self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, because it makes you think that behaviour is okay, and that there'll always be this kind of reason, and that you don't have the responsibility or self-control over your testosterone or your actions. I can't understand what it must be like to have testosterone pumping through my body. It's hard enough to bloody understand whatever's happening here, estrogen, all that bullshit. But it's, we need to put more control, and that can be liberating. That can be, rather than going, oh, he just lashed out. He couldn't, if we can liberate our young men to feel like they have that control, and that they do need to find ways to use that energy that they may have, or these urges. I don't know.
It really needs to come from women. Everything you said was right, but it really needs to come from women, because you talked about you don't know what it's like to have testosterone. It's very confusing, because you're just right. You're just right about everything. You're an idiot, and then you get told, well, boys will be boys for inexcusable behavior. And the people who've made most sense. I was raised by my mom. She straightened me out on a lot of things. I'm surrounded by women in my workplace. I've been educated. Punk rock, I come from a very egalitarian punk rock scene in Washington, D.C. I've been schooled on this since I was a kid. And it really needs to, women really need to tell men what time it is. And men need to listen. But rarely will it come from another man as well as it will come from a woman.
Do you mean like a woman as in a mother to a young son? Or, because I've tried to speak to a lot of men
I've
who
also
are...
found
a
the
mom,
opposite.
a sister, a friend, a boss, a schoolmate, just to go, wow, I really like you. You really need to sit down and listen. Because I've learned some great lessons from women. Many years ago, I was saying something on stage. I said a woman told me, it was like a stand-up routine. A woman told me the time she got hit, but the third time her boyfriend hit her. And I said, there's the first two times? Like, you stuck around for a third time? That was incredible to me. Like, either kill him or leave. Like, why do you stick around? I didn't get it. And thankfully, a woman sat me down and said, Henry, you mean well, but you are really off base with this. Why did she not leave? Because he's got the car. He's got the credit cards. They have a kid. There are so many reasons she doesn't leave. Like, you got to just really check that out. And I was like, wow, because I meant no harm at all. I was like, leave, like, get out. Come over to my place. Like, just anything, get out. And she really helped me. So I'm not trying to be some idiot. But it was a woman who straightened me out. No man did that. And I don't know if a man could have straightened me out better on that than a woman.
I think that depends on the situation, because I've been on stage where I've been performing, and I had a male in the audience continuously shout out, "Show us your tits," throughout the entire thing, and women around him were telling him to shut up, to leave, to get away. And it wasn't until my bandmate, who is a male, stopped us performing halfway through the show, stood on the side of stage and said, "You're a disgrace to all the men that are here enjoying themselves." And it wasn't till then that the whole crowd and him and that person in particular felt really impacted. Because I think as much as you're saying, like, it should be women and men should be talking together about these issues, there is a level, I'm just going to say it bluntly, men don't listen to women. Because to say that women have their voices heard now as if we haven't been saying anything is a load of shit. We've been talking about this for a really long time. This is the first time that men are actually having to be accountable for what we're saying. And I think that both men and women should be talking about this and trying to educate our young men as much as we put in the energy to educate women on not being in a position where they will be harmed. I think we need to put the same amount of energy into making men feel comfortable with who they are and not feel the need to assault another person in order to feel powerful.
And I also think with what you said before, Henry, the things that you said before, that was one of the first times that I've heard a man sit on a stage and speak to a group of people about those things in Australia. I haven't, and I think that there is no denying that had to get through to some people, whether the crowd are progressive and already have these ideas, or whether they're here to learn. Hearing it from a man of success and, all of those things, it honestly does make a huge difference. And look at Terry Crews, I often, if I'm having an argument with someone, a male about a certain thing, or, toxic masculinity and those issues, I'll actually send them a link to Terry Crews rather than a woman TED Talk or, something like that, because I know that I need someone needs to speak that language, and sometimes it takes another man to do that, unfortunately.
Yeah, and your point was well taken, as far as, like, you know, someone in your band went, stop everything. That was perfect. And so, as you said before, with the idea of consent, it's such a nuanced thing, and I think ultimately everyone needs to listen. Yeah. But we need to be starting to volunteer really good information. Yeah. And everyone needs to be brave on all sides, just to speak up. And talking is one thing. Listening can be very difficult, and learning from and carrying forward. I don't know how it is for women, but for men we can be very frustratingly thick-skulled.
I think also from like our end, I think there is also the space. I mean, especially with the MeToo movement coming out and being able for the first time for a lot of women to actually openly be angry and pissed off with what we've had to deal with as a society, as a normal upbringing as a female. I think there is also space to actually be willing to let people ask you the questions that are probably considered the stupid questions, or ask you the baseline questions, or ask you, I'm not getting this, like, what am I not getting? Let's have a chat about this. Because I also see it happening where men are trying to have those conversations, but they're also being shut down by being saying, oh, well, you're a cis white male, you don't even know what you're talking about. It's like, well, if they don't, I do feel like it is, like, on some level my responsibility in that instance to have a really, like, ground level conversation about it, where I'm not accusing them of being ignorant or like having lived a more privileged life than me. I'm there to also allow them to have the space to ask. It's a two-way conversation. You're definitely right in that regard.
And I think you've touched on three, really: the education part, which are these conversations and those transformative moments you have when you learn. You also touched on the allies, you know, having the men that do need to speak up and help us and do some of the lifting, and fantastic, the bandmate story there. And you also touched on, Stella, the Australian cultural context, which is sort of what I touched at the beginning with the clothing stuff. And some, you know, we're dealing with, you know, a lot of issues around masculinity and and where are the men that are standing up and speaking and sitting on a panel like this? So we're at a very thin edge, you know, and you know, where are you? Because there's not a lot of writing by men or doing the lifting or having these conversations with us in public, is my sense. And Tracey, you're nodding. I don't know if anyone wants to throw into that, but I think that the Australian cultural context is a worldwide movement and phenomenon, and this sort of zeitgeist of change, but we've also got some specific challenges in Australia.
Yeah, we have a very masculine culture and history in this country, and that's what we're battling against. But I'm very optimistic here. I don't know whether any of you have read the work of Dr. Michael Flood. He's amazing. He talks about the code of mateship that makes it very difficult for men to speak up, because a man feels that if he speaks up to ally with a female in the workplace or in society, or speaks up against a sexist joke, that his friends will then make fun of him. And that fear of shame and humiliation is very huge in that matey Australian culture. So Michael Flood's trying to work to unpack that, to have men in small groups talk to each other and say, look, this is no good. If you stand up and stand with me and speak out against this, we can do this together. So it's flipping that code of mateship on its head.
We are closing in on our last 20 minutes together. I'm conscious of leaving time for a couple of questions from the floor. If you have got something to ask, start thinking about your question and not a... we've got good to get through a few, so have a question for us, not a full story, if possible. And the other thing, before we do that too, because we want to hear about your choice and think about again where we are here at Splendour in the Grass together for the next few days, but also to sort of shift more away from consent to personal boundaries. And, you know, this is an opportunity for the audience to have a bit of perspective, particularly the performers, and, you know, you've all got public lives. How do you navigate boundaries around who you are, and maybe some insights? Also, it's a bit like what you touched on before, Nkechi, with the hair being picked up on stage. But when you walk through a festival like this, as someone knows who you are, what's it like for you when it comes to your personal boundaries?
Can I start? And I'll be very brief, because I'm the one guy on the stage. I'm 57 and a half. I know I look 28, but I'm almost 60. I've had my photo taken and been in the world of that since I was 18. So I have long forgotten what it's like to just walk unnoticed. I have been groped, put upon to the point since I was a kid in entertainment by men and women who have grabbed me, tried to put their tongue in my mouth, grab all parts of me, and it's not cool, to the point where I have to look under a rock to find my self-esteem. And I go outside and I just go, okay, I just lost my First and Fourth Amendment rights. Right to freedom of expression, right to privacy. That's American constitutional talk, I'm sorry. Where as soon as I leave my house or the tour bus or the tent, whatever, I realize I'm up for grabs. And many times I've done photographs with people in the day of the cell phone. There's a lot of that. If I had $1 for every time a woman, often with her significant other taking the photo, has grabbed me, well, I'm like, whoa, I don't know what to do in that moment. So I feel I just have my own example of it. I can't say I know what it's like to be a woman. I wouldn't dare. But I feel extremely exploited, and I just gotten used to it. And it's ruinous to your idea of your own sense of personal space, because I feel I have none. People walk up to me and slap their hand on my shoulder. My instinct is to turn around and see if I can take that windpipe out. When all that guy means is, I love that guy. There's Henry at the airport. I thought he was taller. I'm going over there. I kind of recognize him even though he has gray hair, and that guy will come over like, Henry! And I am rattled for the rest of the day. Or I come out of a men's room, there's a guy right there, like right out of the stall. Photo? I'm like, ha! And so people outside my house leaving me gifts, calling my name. I live in a very
So do you try and put a
world.
boundary, or you just have to, you
No,
feel you just got to suck it up?
I just gonna go thanks and just keep moving and shop late at night so I get talked to less. I never had the guts to go like, stop it.
Okay.
I've never done it.
Ladies, well, how do you navigate this?
Well, actually, this is a tiny bit long-winded, but I'll try and make it very short. For me, as someone who is black in Australian society or considered black, it has taken me a long time to be comfortable with my blackness, and I thought I was actually pretty fine, but after starting a website with my best friend and meeting my best friend, I actually realised I had a lot that was tied into my hair. And for black women, hair is it's our fucking crown. And it's only in the last 3 years that I've actually been able to wear my hair out in a full afro and not feel embarrassed about it, or look in the mirror and be like, you look like a bush bitch, which I know is like the worst thing to kind of say about yourself, but that's how I used to see myself growing up. And it hasn't been until recently that when I wear my hair out, when I go to look in the mirror, I think this is going to be the day where I'm going to fucking hate myself again. And it's been one of these weird experiences where I don't have that, and I have been enjoying it. And last year, with my friend who's also here and who I started the pin with, we were walking through the crowd at this festival last year at Splendour on the first night, and we probably had about between 10 or 15 people decide that it was okay to put their hands through our hair while we were watching a show. And I don't like really being confrontational, so my reaction was for it to put my hair down into braids and to put it in a tiny little like top knot bubble thing, because I just couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle having that conversation 15 times in one night, or to be watching a band that I fucking love and have to think, am I going to get harassed, or is someone going to touch me while I do this? So anyway, it's probably the second day of the festival, and we're watching a band at the amphitheatre, and there was a heap of us, there was just both of us there, but we were in this very kind of like really tight-packed area of the mosh pit, I guess, and a guy went and grabbed my friend's hair, and I froze. The assault wasn't even happening to me. I froze, and she turned around and she said, "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" And he was like, "Oh, I'm just like, I've never seen hair." And she's like, "Would you fucking do that to anybody around here?" And feeling weird about the fact that he had touched this black person's hair, he went to touch another girl's hair next to kind of show that he was touching everyone's hair. That was his thing. And the girl and her best friend turned around and said, "Don't you fucking touch my friend." And I think when you talk about allies, my allies are my best friends and my friends that stand with me when I walk through a crowd, who know when I'm not doing okay and who are there to stand in and say, "She's not your property. You don't own her." Just because you've seen me stand on stage, or just because you feel like you've had a connection, or maybe you have had a genuine connection with me through performance and having that audience performer interaction, doesn't mean you know me, doesn't mean you can touch me, doesn't mean I'm your property. So for me, my strongest allies are my friends and the people around me who respect me and know that it's not on.
So Stella, Tracey, Bri, how are you going to navigate the weekend?
Well, you know, I think I hate the term situational and awareness after the last kind of, you know, month we've had. You know, the police commissioner used that term, you know, to warn women and to tell women that they need to have situational awareness, you know, when it came to the murder of Eurydice Dixon. But unfortunately, we're not in a time where we are completely safe yet. So for me, when I kind of walk around a festival as an artist, I have my best friends or my tour manager or my manager or whoever with me, and you know, we've got code words, we've got blinks, we've got, you know, all of those sorts of things, and it's so sad, because what it does is sometimes I may have just had like a bad experience. You know, someone may have come up and been like, "I want to marry you," and grab my tits or something like that. And then 10 minutes later, a really amazing woman comes up just to have a chat to me, or an amazing man comes up, whoever comes up to just have a chat to me about music, or, you know, they're studying this thing and they find this, and, you know, a conversation that I would really benefit from. But my defences are so far up that I actually might seem quite rude. You know, I might have this kind of, as I'm sure, yeah, as Henry described, you know, the pat on the shoulder, you know, it's a friendly thing, but you've just dealt with fucking 4 accounts of, you know, harassment or assault before that. So, you know, if you do ever go up and see your favourite artist, or, you know, someone that you really want to have a chat to, just keep that in mind. I think it's super important. We have our situational awareness, but I think it's important for everyone else too as well, when it comes to how we treat others.
So true.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stella.
Yeah.
Tracey, Bri?
I wish I could say situational, right? Sorry, I'll get there one day. Situational, it'll be fine. Look, I don't know. I mean, I love being 51 years old and an outspoken feminist, because people are too fucking scared to touch me now. And that is awesome, I have to say. I love being the invisible older woman. But the reason why that makes me so happy is because I grew up as the big-titted, bleached-haired bogan chick from Brisbane, okay? So from the age of 14, I had people giving me inappropriate hugs. You know, that holding too close so your boobs squish against their body? And because I was the good girl, I didn't know what to say and I didn't know what to do. So now, and I said this at Woodford as well, because someone asked me in the audience, what happens, you know, I've got a male friend and he comes up and he gives me hugs and I just don't like it, but he's my friend, what do I do? And that happens a lot in this environment. I do this really structured, strategic hug now. If a bloke comes up and wants to hug me, I'll hold the shoulders, I'll pull in a bit, but I'll make sure it doesn't touch my tits. So in a way, you've got to physically control your own boundaries and body space if that's happening to you. It sounds like something little, but after years and years of being touched inappropriately, it feels so powerful to be able to control that space between you and someone else.
Thank you. Bri, do you want to add anything?
I don't have any sort of physically immediate examples since writing the book. Partially because a writers' festival is there's just like more clothes than at a music festival for a start. Like it's really different. Like people, for a start at writers' festivals, it's like 85% older women, at least. And so I don't have any of that physical sense of threat. But, and I'm sure Tracey would be like second to follow this up, that my inbox right now is a bit of a battleground. I haven't gotten as many nasty trolls as I thought, but what I do have is a lot of people maybe well-intentioned, but very, very obviously thinking that they are completely entitled to my, like, legal expertise, time, travel, effort. I had one man who sent me a message because he had heard me speak on television, hadn't read the book, but he thought that his daughter might like the book. And I was like, all right, I'm listening. And then was like, yeah, so if I can just have your home address and I'll just post you a copy of the book with a return satchel, can you please write this in the book for me? And I was like, oh, I can't really give you my home address. And he's like, oh, that's okay. Here's the address of my office. It's just on Eagle Street in Brisbane City. You can just swing by and I'll just leave it with my receptionist and you can come up to my office and sign this book and write this inscription for my daughter. Thank you so much. Like, thank you so much. Here's the address.
The assumption.
The assumption. Like, there's just this... Yeah, and so I can't imagine how much more, like, really frightening what you have described is, but that sense of entitlement is really frustrating and upsetting and quite pervasive.
Yes.
Thank you all for sharing that. We are almost out of time, and I do want to give Stacey the last word on this because this is where your choice fits. And we've just heard of what this experience can be like. So what is your choice trying to achieve with the culture out there?
We just want to encourage critical thinking from people, and we want, people to think that before they do something, that there are ramifications for the choices that they're about to make, and to think about those and think about how the actions are going to affect other people, and think about the flow-on effect and how one small decision that you make without thinking can have a huge impact on not just one person but a lot of people who are going to end up having to deal with that. And one thing that I will leave you with, because in a meeting the other week, Tamara from New South Wales Health, I told her I'd credit her with this because I thought it was brilliant, said to me this line, which I think if you continually think about that in these situations, you really can't go wrong. She said, what you permit, you promote. So if you sit there and say, I don't believe in sexual assault, I think that harassment is wrong, I do this, I do that, but then one of your friends does that to somebody, or somebody does that to you and you don't speak up, basically by permitting that behaviour, you are in effect promoting it. And when you put that thought back into people's head that they are promoters of that kind of behaviour, it takes a very different feeling to them. So yeah, have a good time, but just be accountable and take responsibility for the decisions that you make, and just be aware that everything you do has an impact and a flow on.
Thank you, Stacey.
Yeah.
Before you say that, Stella, because thank you, Stella's performing soon, so I'm going to give you whatever you need to say, and then I'm going to give you permission to leave the stage, and then we've got time for one question, and then we can do the wrap-up. Yeah?
Yeah, I just want to call upon all the artists who are playing at Splendour this weekend, June Rats included. If you see someone being assaulted and if you see someone getting hurt in your crowd, you need to call it out, because as you said, artists, you are up on stage, you can stop shit. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. So please thank Stella Donnelly, 3 p.m. over in the GW McLennan. But stay where you are. We're not over yet. We're just... thank you, Stella, and don't miss that. We do have time for one question. We've got a couple of minutes. Front row, this is the orange box here, to the lady in the brown jacket. Thank you.
Hey,
Get some micro...
so I'll make this quick.
Talk into the box.
Like this?
Yeah.
So this is a question mainly tying into what Nkechi and Bri said. Sorry, closer. I'm first year university, and I've noticed that a lot of consent campaigns at university are centered around the idea of consent being really simple. Experiences that I have noticed around my high school and at university have not been simple at all, and that really ties into what you were saying. I wanted to hear your thoughts about what you thought about that and whether or not we should be taking consent campaigns in a different direction. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that consent campaigns are good in that they're putting out the idea that consent is needed and that it needs to be discussed and it needs to be in your head when you're interacting with other people and navigating your behaviour around consent. But I do think as much as slogans are really good at getting in people's mind, I think it simplifies it way too much. I think it simplifies human experience and interaction way too much. I'm not a professional in any other field than being a musician, so I can't really say what I would do to change that. But I think on a personal level, if a situation is not going the way that you need it to go for you to feel safe, if it's not going the way that you need to feel safe, I hope that in that situation you have the support group around you that you can go to. And I hope you don't experience a situation where you don't have that. I think one of the amazing things that are happening in our society right now is that traditionally female identity and female power has come from the way that society has perceived them, and for men it's the way that they put themselves out in the world. And I think we're going through this very beautiful revolution where women are much stronger now in the way that society perceives them and listens to what they have to say. But I think, we need to keep the discussion of consent going. I don't think it's as simple as saying no is no or yes is yes, because if it was that simple, we would not be dealing with such a fucked up injustice for people who do make claims of abuse, assault and rape. It would be much more cut and dry than that. Yeah.
Thanks, Nkechi. Bri and Tracey, you're a campaigner. What have you got to say?
Yeah, it's really hard. It's hard to articulate that there will always be a difference between almost like the social definition of consent and the fact that any legal definition requires a black and white distinction to some degree. And I think that the way I conceptualize it is that we can work towards the best possible legal definition for consent that will still always necessitate drawing a line somewhere. But then that social definition, I mean, you're judged by a jury of 12 of your peers. They bring that social definition into the courtroom with them. And that in a courtroom setting, judges are in charge of matters of law and juries are in charge of matters of fact. But a judge can, in Queensland, I know for sure, and I'm sure it's the same similar in other states, if a jury write a letter to the judge and ask for clarification on what consent means, the judge gets to choose how they address the jury on that question. And there are all of these opportunities where the legal definition of consent, which is much more black and white, is absolutely affected by the social understanding of what consent is, which never will be as black and white as the legal definition. So I see them, at the moment we're suffering with both of them being not good enough, but they can possibly in the future help raise each other up.
Thank you. Tracey, do you want to add anything as a campaigner with the slogan part of the question? Is it as simple as the slogan? Well, it's not, is what we've heard. But with you run with Now, and then with the student university campaigns, because with the problems that have been documented in universities, what is the advice as a campaigner of what the universities could be doing?
Oh, yeah, but it's broader advice, because underlying all of this is the gender power imbalance. And we've seen generations of boys and men being brought up to believe that they are entitled to women's and girls' bodies. So until that changes, we will still see breaches of consent. But I am excited about conversations about preschool children being taught about this, because that's where it will change in the next generation. The other way it will change is, and we were talking about this before, Henry, having more women in positions of power in all parts of society. The judiciary, the police, politics, universities. When we have a less of a power imbalance between men and women, then there will be clearer, defined lines when it comes to consent, because what is happening now is people taking advantage of their power in society.
And to speak of what Bri said, all of these laws in my country, in your country, they favor the men. They favor the assaulter. Around the world, it's even more radical. Like in India, you're like, what? Like, she went to jail after getting raped. She's at fault. And like you and I were talking about, minimum 50-50 in charge. Me, I'm a bit radical. I'd like a 75-25 power share with women in the lead. Let's try that for about 5,000 years, and we'll see if it was a bad idea. How will it work? Well, there's only one way to find out, and I'm ready to start right now. And that idea of parsing out power far more equally, I think, is such a great way to start, because I think only there'll be some turbulence at the beginning, but I think it would be really instructive and good going forward. Because as it is now, everything is in the male's favor, because who made the law? I mean, it's the boys' club, they all wrote it down, and we all have to abide. And women always get the raw end of the deal.
To answer your question a bit more specifically, perhaps from my perspective, is one of the reasons I find myself almost intuitively fighting against this idea of a grey zone is because women get fucked over by the grey zone much more than men do. And so although I acknowledge absolutely on a social level nothing in the world is black and white, sure. But I just have seen it play out too many times that the grey zone, that is where mistake of fact exists. That's where that defence exists, where he had an honest but reasonable belief because of the grey zone. And so that's why I will always just push back against that idea.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think what I'm saying is that it's great that we have these campaigns, but I also think that the human experience that people go through is also as valid, where even if you are the victim and you still don't know what you feel happened in that situation, whether it was consensual or not, is still a valid feeling to have. And in that instance, I feel like you shouldn't feel bad that you can't relate, or that slogan does not relate to your experience.
Thank you all. We are out of time. But just a couple of quick things. Taking Stacey, what you permit, you promote out there is however many people are in the tent here now, maybe 100. What do you reckon? You guys used to be on stage, 100, 120 of you. If you share that message around, and we can make small incremental changes bit by bit and make this a fantastic, an even better event than it already is for everybody in a safe, inclusive way. I'd also, Stella's on at 3. Henry Rollins tonight, 8:30 at the GW McLennan tent. Nkechi, tomorrow you got a panel here at 12:30. Do you want to give a shout out to the topic?
Yeah, the panel is about being a third culture kid, and the basic summary of that is being kind of a part of many things and nothing at the same time.
Thank you. Buy Tracey's book, Bri's book. Get behind those campaigns. I'm off to the official Welcome to Country is at 3 p.m. after this up at the amphitheatre. Well worth participating there as well. And thanks again to Splendour in the Grass, to Faye, to Helen, for all of these amazing panellists. Thanks to Stacey, to Bri, Tracey, Stella, Nkechi and Henry. And thank all of you for coming.
And thank you, Leanne.